It was the night before final exams. The campus library, usually a bustling hub of activity, was quiet now, save for the faint rustling of papers and the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Mark had always preferred the late hours to study. Fewer distractions, fewer people. Tonight was no different. His head buried deep in textbooks, he was determined to ace his finals. But something felt off. The air around him seemed too still, too cold. It wasn't the usual emptiness that came with a nearly deserted library. No, this was different. He could feel it. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. He glanced up from his notes, scanning the dimly lit rows of bookshelves. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Just rows of towering shelves, filled with old, dusty books. And then, his eyes caught something. Someone. There, behind the third row, barely visible through the gaps in the books, was a girl. She looked to be about his age. Her head was resting on her hands, elbows propped on the shelf, her face peeking through the space between the books. She was smiling, an unnervingly wide smile, as if she'd been watching him for a while. Mark blinked, startled by how still she was, her eyes unblinking. She didn't move, just stared. He shook his head, trying to focus. Maybe she was just another student pulling an all-nighter like him. He dismissed the odd encounter and went back to his books. Minutes passed, or was it hours? Time seemed to blur as the silence of the library deepened. The few other patrons who had been scattered around the tables had left, and now it seemed like Mark was the only one left. The soft ticking of the wall clock seemed to echo through the space, each tick growing louder, sharper. And yet, he couldn't shake that feeling, that heavy, sinking feeling. He felt her eyes on him again. This time, when he looked up, the girl was no longer behind the third row of bookshelves. She had moved. She was closer. 2 shelves away now, staring through another gap in the books, still smiling, still unmoving. Mark's stomach tightened with unease. Something about her was wrong. The way her eyes locked onto him, unblinking, fixated. It sent a chill down his spine. He tried to convince himself it was nothing, just another tired student messing around. But deep down, he knew better. There was something unnatural about the way she watched him. He looked back down at his notes, trying to ignore the dread creeping up his neck. But then, a faint tapping sound broke the silence. It was rhythmic, deliberate. He froze, his fingers tightening around his pen. The tapping grew louder. He slowly turned his head. The girl was gone. His heart raced as he scanned the aisles, his pulse thudding in his ears. The library felt colder now, the air thick with something unnameable. He pushed his chair back, the scraping sound echoing unnervingly in the vast, empty space. Suddenly, there was a soft shuffling sound, just behind him. He turned quickly, only to see her again. This time, she wasn't behind the shelves. She was standing at the end of his table, and she was still smiling. Her eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to gleam under the dim library lights. But something was wrong. Something horrifying. Her lower half. It wasn't there. The girl was floating, her body cut off at the waist, as if she had been sliced in half. Mark's breath caught in his throat, paralyzed by fear. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body wouldn't respond. The girl's smile widened unnaturally, her eyes never leaving his. She was closer now. Too close. In a panic, Mark finally pushed his chair back and bolted toward the library doors. His footsteps echoed through the empty halls, but that eerie tapping sound followed him, quickening in pace, growing louder. He reached the exit and slammed into the doors, his hands fumbling to pull them open. They wouldn't budge. Panic set in. He looked over his shoulder, and there she was, mere feet away, her half-body gliding silently across the floor, elbows scraping against the ground as she inched closer and closer. Mark pounded on the door, desperate to escape, but it was too late. The last thing he saw was her twisted smile as she lunged forward, her hand outstretched, cold fingers brushing his skin. And then... darkness. The next morning, the library was quiet again, just as it had been the night before. Students came and went, unaware of the events that had unfolded just hours earlier. But if you looked closely, in the dim corners of the library, you might see a figure. A girl, smiling from behind the shelves. And if you stay too long, if you linger after the lights begin to dim, you might just hear it. The sound of tapping, growing closer, inch by inch. Subscribe for more.